more than just a respite from the unusual heat for October 2nd, but a really
Damn, it's hot.
superb discussion ahead about Bolivia's upcoming elections. As you all know, Bolivians head to the polls on October 20th. President Evo Morales is seeking a fourth consecutive term, having first been elected in 2005. He narrowly lost a bid in a 2016 referendum that would have permitted him to serve an extra term, but the Constitutional Court struck that down, opening the way for Morales to run again. Carlos Mesa, who served as interim president in 2003-2005, is the closest challenger, and if no candidate gets at least 50% of the vote, or gets 40% of the vote with a 10-point lead over the nearest competitor, there will be a runoff election on December 15th. So we're really pleased that you joined us today for a discussion about the issues that have defined the electoral campaign, the potential voting scenarios, the implications for Bolivia if Morales is voted out of office or retains the presidency for another 5-year term, and the challenges that will await the winning candidate. And we're very lucky today to have Kathryn Ledebur, Director of the Andean Information Network, and Rob Albro, Research Associate Professor at Center for Latin American and Latino Studies at American University. I will say we're videoing the discussion today, so it will be available on our website afterwards. And our format will be, Kath will speak first, Rob will speak second. I'll keep time, and we'll leave plenty of time for question, answer, and discussion. And just to set you up, Kath, I just did some sort of fun facts, quick math, and since he first won the election, Evo Morales has been in office for nearly 14 years, if I have my math right. And of course, he's seeking another 5-year term, so that would be nearly 20 years in office. And I think it's interesting to note that in the 14 years before Evo was first elected, there were, by my count, 7 presidents of Bolivia. Of course, Goni served twice in that time period. So 7 presidents.
1.5.
1.5, call it 1.5 terms. 7 presidents over 14 years, and now Evo's been in office for 14 and with a chance at 5. So as we discuss the current context, it would be interesting to be able to reflect on what are the factors behind Evo's longevity as president, in this phase of Bolivian democracy, and what has been changing in Bolivia. There's some of those bigger issues. So without further ado, I'll hand it to Kat, and then we'll go right to Rob, and then we'll open it up. Thank you.
Thanks so much, John. It's wonderful to be here. Thanks also to Rob to be able to share a debate with him is wonderful. I just wanted to, one of the things that AIN has done consistently and for several decades with the assistance of WOLA is to look at the version of events in Bolivia on the ground. And I think that although the situation in Bolivia has changed dramatically, the availability of balanced English language reporting, analysis, or documentation on issues in Bolivia continues to be quite sparse. We focused for a long time on the negative impact of U.S. anti-drug cooperation and impositions. We've looked at the broader impact of U.S. influence, political instability, and at this point in time, we want to look more broadly at the Bolivian elections from an on-the-ground perception and being able to look at the changes that have taken place over this period of time in Bolivia. And I think it's important to note that the Morales administration is an administration filled with contradictions. It has many flaws. It's committed many errors, but it has been able to maintain itself in power through clean elections. The continuing re-election of Morales have been processes of great debate, but you have to also look at the administration's ability to extend economic and social programs, a lot of this through the hydrocarbons law that allows greater percentages of hydrocarbons revenue to go to social programs, to really extend to rural areas, to really focus on education and how to really address areas that were key points of friction or that determined the bilateral dialogue with the United States and the international positioning of Bolivia. And so there's a lot said about Morales's errors and Morales's shortcomings, but very few things are said about the ability of this government to maintain power and to maintain a very broad coalition. These constant shifts of power before and the friction and the changes in government largely were a result of the bankruptcy of the traditional party system. It's not so much that the Mas government or the Morales government was able to defeat these parties as it was that their own incompetence, their infighting, their inability to enact social programs or a working government plan without dependence of the United States and the United States dictates culminated in gross human rights violations in October of 2003 in the gas war and a total discrediting of this traditional party system. It wasn't so much Mas smothering the parties as it was a kind of suicide of these parties through their inability to govern. It's also important to note, and I've seen many U.S. press accounts about indigenous people no longer supporting Evo Morales or what indigenous people think in Bolivia, and they always seem to be presented as this kind of block group with, and really it's a very diverse group. It's a very diverse group with sometimes conflicting interests. If we look at, for example, the coca growers, Aymara and Quechua farmers who have colonized or moved into Amazonian areas, they're in direct conflict with their land vision and land use view with the Amazonic and the other groups that are present in those regions. So indigenous voters don't vote as a bloc. Indigenous voters' views on Morales are mixed. They are constantly changing. They are not predictable. But there has to be, but indigenous voters, like all voters, are pragmatists, or most voters, we hope, are pragmatists. Sometimes in United States elections, I'm concerned that that is not the case. But they're evaluating the options available to them. So one of the things we have to evaluate in this electoral season is Mas's track record, the Morales' government's track record, its achievements, its failures, its shortcomings, its challenges, possibility for a new future, but we also have to evaluate the options or the programs that are presented by the other candidates. And what we need to highlight is that there are a great deal of limitations on the part of the Bolivian opposition. I think it's pretty important to look at an opposition that remains divided, an opposition that has lost power over 14 years ago, and that has not been able to form strategic alliances, has not been able to present a program, has not been able to legislatively present initiatives to question the Morales government's initiatives, and really seem to be, in terms of their electoral programs, quite out of touch with the reality of Bolivia. And you see there are many things to critique about the Morales government. Generally, the things that the opposition critique them for are not, in my perception, the inherent flaws or the difficulties that the Morales government faces. If you look at Carlos Mesa, I think it's important to note that he is an individual that was respected as a historian, was a journalist that was allied with the MNR party, became the vice presidential candidate for Gonzalo Sanchez de Lozada. His alliance with Gonzalo Sanchez de Lozada initially created friction with the Bolivian left. The discrediting of Gonzalo Sanchez de Lozada after Black October, the killing of 69 civilians in El Alto and the Altiplano, also deteriorated his image. It's important to note that he pulled away from that violence, he protested against that violence, and he became vice president of Bolivia. But in his term as vice president, over a year and a half, he faced many significant challenges, and he ended up, under significant popular pressure, resigning. So, one of the challenges that Mesa has is that the traditional left rejects him for his alliance with Gonzalo Sanchez de Lozada. The neoliberal parties and the traditional parties on the right associate him with the downfall of their traditional party system. One of the difficulties he had as president when he assumed power is that he had no party rank and file. He had no allies that represented him in Congress. He had no significant popular following that could provide support for him in his state initiatives. And during the period of time since his resignation, that has not changed. So you have a second place presidential candidate that has at one time or another alienated both sides on the political spectrum. You have a presidential candidate that has done some very good things. For example, his government signed the Cato of Coca Accord that became, with the Chapari coca growers, that became the cornerstone of the Bolivian government's very successful community coca control and integrated development initiative. He also, though, during his time as president, refused to back a constitutional tribunal ruling which mandated military personnel committing gross human rights violations having to be tried in civilian courts. So there are difficulties with Mesa's strengths and weaknesses and shifting positions. But another thing that's very important to mention about Mesa is that during his tenure as president, he called a referendum on the hydrocarbons issue. There were key questions. Should the Bolivian hydrocarbons law be, that was written by Gonzalo Sanchez de Lozada, be revoked? Should there be new legislation that's investing a greater share of the hydrocarbons revenues into the Bolivian system and social programs? And should there be nationalization of the hydrocarbons? This was a referendum that won by an enormous margin, and that Mesa refused to accept the results. He was not happy with the way the law was drafted. He refused to sign the hydrocarbons law into act, and the resulting process led to his resignation. So many people bring up that Evo Morales had a referendum on the election issue, which he lost by 2%. And he argued extenuating circumstances, the great movement about the fabricated baby mama issue and the influence trafficking issue. But Mesa also rejected the results of a popular referendum that he himself called. So you have the top two candidates on the referendum issue have a similar situation. And I think that that's very rarely brought into the discussion. The other thing that you need to consider about Mesa is that he does not have a strong party affiliation. He is currently running as the candidate for the Leftist Revolutionary Front, a party that was initially Maoist, then Marxist-Leninist, then affiliated with the MNR party, also affiliated with the AIN Banzer's party, and part of Banzer's government coalition. It is a party that has shifted positions frequently. It is a party that's never had a key role, and they've allied with the mayor of La Paz to have something which is an alliance called Comunidad Ciudadana. And so there is a candidate who played a key role with the Morales administration in the Secor case, but has strategically alienated many sectors of the Bolivian voting population. El Alto, for example, which is an area that voted against Morales in the municipal election. But another important point that I think we need to make is that municipal actors on the municipal level in Bolivia don't project well. Municipal politics and national politics are very dissimilar, and they're not good projectors. So Mas voted against, Mas lost in the mayoral races in El Alto, and El Alto has mixed feelings about Evo Morales, but they have very clear feelings about Carlos Mesa, who did not attend the Sanchez de Lozada trial in Miami, the civil court case against him, and there's a great deal of resentment on that local level. I think that Bolivian voter opinions are largely misrepresented in political analysis here and in analysis in the mainstream U.S. press. I think that it's important to note that Bolivian voters will vote for stability over uncertainty. Bolivian voters will tend to look to those issues, and economic well-being. It's important to note that Bolivia has one of the highest growth rates in Latin America, and that there's been an almost 30% reduction in extreme poverty during Morales' tenure. this economic stability and this rising tide, also remember that the economy has improved and that you have private enterprise often siding with the Morales administration. You have large-scale Santa Cruz agricultural interests siding with the Morales administration. It is very hard to obtain votes against a strong economy or to have an alternative vision to a strong economy. And many people talk about Morales' socialist economy. Many people speak of, it's very popular in Bolivia and in U.S. circles to talk about Bolivia being just like Venezuela. And as we know, those of us who are Bolivian watchers, that it's a very, very different dynamic, that it's a very different economic dynamic. It's important to note that the movement towards socialism is originally called the Sovereign Movement, the Independent Movement for the Sovereignty of the Peoples. And so it's a grassroots movement, it's a pragmatic movement, it's a unique economic and political vision that works and functions within Bolivia. Not without its flaws, not without its contradictions, but it's not a pure socialist model, and the economic management is very different than that of Venezuela. The analysis of the pink tide or the loss of the pink tide, none of those, Bolivia has been an anomaly in many cases in terms of economic stability, in terms of political stability, in terms of management of key issues. And these are things that will work in Morales' favor in the upcoming electoral period. I think that it's important to note that a lack of alternatives for working class voters, for voters in rural areas, for voters who identify as indigenous people. The other candidates in the opposition have made very little effort to be representative in terms of different ethnicities, different class issues. It's a largely white, upper middle class bloc. It's interesting to note that Bolivia's had for many years now a gender parity law. Bolivia's Congress has more female members than any other country in the world except Rwanda, and gender parity is respected at the different levels. But the MAS party is the only party that presented slates of candidates that complied with the gender parity legislation. So there's another flaw. It's important to note that 4 of the opposition parties had the resignation of either a presidential or a vice presidential candidate during the course of a campaign. This is something that also weakens their vision or focus. It's important to note that this representative nature of the MAS government, in spite of frustrations and limitations and shortfalls and contradictions such as the Tunis highway issue, has generally led voters to opt for this stability. I think it's important to note also that the Bolivian government is the largest formal employer in the country at this point in time, and large formal employment with an extension of social benefits, and benefits such as stipends and food items for pregnant women and through the child's first year. Housing benefits are things that have completely benefited the population, although cash transfer and bonus programs have been criticized outside. It's important to note that I see a lot of information about the Bolivian polls and what the Bolivian polls say and what will happen, and that Bolivian polls are all over the place. They're frequently released. They have contradictory information. What we've begun to look at is the monthly average of the Bolivian poll data to try to get an idea of trends. And those trends show that Morales is leading Mesa with an 11 to 12% lead. It's my assessment that Morales will most likely win in the first round. It may go to a second round. The third place candidate, Oscar Ortiz of Bolivia y Uno, has a block and has had a lot of internal friction with Mesa. It's not clear in a second round if they would ally. I think that it's important to note that the Organization of American States has said it will not vote, it will not speak out or denounce the Bolivian electoral process, that they will be sending a team of observers. I think that it's unfortunate that the opposition has called out and said that they feel very certain that it will not be reliable, OAS monitoring. There's no indication that OAS electoral monitoring won't be reliable. There will be EU monitoring. And my assumption is there won't be fraud in the elections. I find it very worrisome that there are announcements immediately, beginning now, that there will clearly be fraud in the Bolivian electoral processes. I don't think that's been the case in the past. I think that if MAS was interested in carrying out fraud, they probably wouldn't have lost the referendum. I think the loss in the referendum is an indication that the Bolivian voting process is transparent. The question is, what happens with a new MAS term? I say that a new MAS term is a given. We are looking at the potential of MAS losing its 2/3 congressional majority. But we're looking at an opposition in Congress that most likely will not be a unified bloc ideologically, or a bloc that will propose initiatives. I think that a strong opposition with strong proposals do very much to stimulate the democratic process. It raises the bar for everyone. It forces the government in power to fine-tune its game. And unfortunately, in this electoral process, we haven't had that happen. We don't have a series of procedures or proposals that allow voters to question or to have an alternative that at this point is viable. We've had waves of denunciations, such as Evo Morales has started the fires in Chiquitania. Morales' environmental policies are not particularly solid. The slash and burn agriculture is something that is characteristically a problem in Amazonian regions. Climate change is a problem in these regions. The Morales government did pass a supreme decree that authorized some slash and burn, and that is problematic. But the idea that the Morales administration is responsible for the fires, and often on Facebook, Coletta and I are collaborating with the Morales administration in starting and spreading the fires. Yes, Coletta has not been as helpful as she appears on Facebook. Are things that kind of point to a superficial level. And then, there are other problems with the opposition candidates, because I think the problems that MAS has, where we hear about and we're more aware of, and they definitely exist, but with opposition candidates, it's problematic, for example, that Carlos Mesa received a $30,000 deposit from the Santa Cruz police chief who's been indicted for drug trafficking, a deposit that he has contradicted himself 4 times in explaining. I am not suggesting that Carlos Mesa is involved in drug trafficking, but I think in the very best case scenario, he's a very bad manager of personal finances, and there's not clarity in how this money appeared. He himself asked the government to identify everyone responsible, and he turned up on the list. These are the kinds of things that complicate the opposition. They complicate candidacies. I mean, it was very embarrassing for MAS to have the Santa Cruz police chief involved in drug trafficking, but that these are the issues that do not reach the English language reporting, and issues that are of great concern, and that in a normal political panorama cause problems for candidates. I know that in the U.S. we are not in a normal political panorama either. But it's important to look at these dynamics. The other thing that I think it's important to look at is the promiscuity of the MAS government and the Morales administration. When you read things in the United States, they talk about an isolated nation. They're tied very closely to Venezuela, being taken over by Chinese investment, and the opposition continually asks for U.S. to engage in the international community and for Bolivia to not close its economy. Well, I think it's important to note that there is a massive external funder in Bolivia that has a great deal of influence, and that is the European Union. The largest single funder of Bolivian government initiatives or external aid is the European Union. Not a dicey, left-wing, questionable government, but a very boring, large, bureaucratic institution that began to strengthen its relationship with Bolivia through this very successful coca control program. It's important to note that this program has led to a dramatic reduction in the Bolivian coca crop. According to the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, the last reporting was 23,100 hectares of coca, compared to over 200,000 hectares of coca in Colombia. You have a high price of coca leaf. It's been the foundation for rural families' incomes. It's being looked at as a model by the Paraguayan government. There's been a bilateral agreement with the previous Colombian administration where Colombian government officials came and Colombian coca growers. And there have been 3 delegations of Peruvian coca growers coming and proposing the same model and meeting with the European Union and meeting with the Peruvian government. So it's interesting to note that on international issues, Bolivia cooperates with the European Union. They cooperate with European governments. They meet periodically with the United States government. If you read the INCSR, they're comparing notes on coca production statistics. The U.S. coca production statistics are moving down closer to the Bolivian and the UNODC coca production. It's not Bolivia isolated from the international community. Bolivia participates in OAS events. They participate actively in CICAD, the drug control arm. Bolivia became this year a member of Mercosur. Bolivia has a series of bilateral trade agreements. Bolivia coordinates with the United Nations with a series of international organisms where they comply with their international agreements. So I wouldn't say that it's an isolated, radical, leftist, socialist government. I would say that it's a pragmatic, promiscuous government with strengths and weaknesses and significant challenges. But there has been, so far electorally, no proposition that can compete with what's been achieved. And I don't think in the upcoming elections there will be any competition. Thank you.
We'll go right to Rob, and then we'll open it for discussion.
Okay, so thank you. Glad to see you here. So when Kathy started talking, she mentioned the word debate, as if we might debate. That's unlikely. I think we mostly concur in the broad sense in what we would imagine might happen in the upcoming election, which is to say that it is extremely likely that it will be a victory for Evo Morales and Mesa in one way or another. If that is not as decisive comparatively as in past elections over the course of his time in office, being in 2006, well, okay, but he's, I think, still going to win comfortably. That being said, I thought I would do 2 things, just very quickly, to complement some of the things that Kathy was saying. So I'm trained as an anthropologist, and so unsurprisingly, what I think I might do is unpack a little bit more of some of the implications of what Kathy alluded to about the relationship between Evo Morales and Mesa and his broad indigenous constituency. Bolivia, as of course you know, is a majority indigenous country, so speaking about this constituency is in a way speaking about, to a certain extent, the average voter. And so to do that, I thought I'd just remind people briefly, it was, I think, mentioned in various ways in what Kathy was saying, about kind of what we're talking about. So when we talk about Evo Morales, we have to remember that we're talking about an historical political leader in Bolivia. We're talking about someone who is identified almost completely with a broad-based social transformational set of changes in that country from the time that he entered office and even really before, during the sort of constant period of social movement mobilization in 2000 to now, with what can only really be described as historical change. And most of you, you would imagine, are basically aware of the outlines of that, but some of the highlights would include his undeniable enfranchisement of indigenous peoples. The 2009 Constitution is a systematic document of 411 articles that details in very precise ways rights of all shapes and sizes, political, economic, religious, legal, and so on, for the country's indigenous peoples. And that's no small accomplishment. That has been continue to be implemented through policies and modes of governance that, we use words like decolonization and so forth to describe in broad brushstrokes, but which really represent a fundamental historical shift in the country's relationship between its demographic, primary demographic and its political process. And I think that we can say that there's no going back. So one of the things that has to be understood is that fact. Just parenthetically, when we think of people like Carlos Mesa as a kind of renovated candidate now, in the present tense, that's part of his problem. One of his basic problems is he is historically situated at a moment prior to everything that I just alluded to. And I think the average Bolivian and most observers still kind of see him as that guy who, while mild-mannered and sort of well disposed, was implicated in all of the things that we identify as the paroxysms leading up to the necessary transformation that Morales oversaw and continued to oversee. So, historical role in the transformation of the fortunes of the rights of Bolivia's majority indigenous population. In addition, though, we can't forget that, as Kathy, I think, outlined, he's been a very competent domestic economic manager, and people act like that, often don't sort of think that through fully. But he's overseen a period of incredible economic growth, routine 4.5% to 5% growth. I think growth for this coming year is projected to be around 4%, so slightly down, but not significantly so. He's used hydrocarbon and other extractive revenues, and I'll come back to this in a minute, in a devil's advocate mode, but just to think through some of the things, some of the weaknesses he might have, and plow those very effectively into social redistributive policies that have raised the level of poverty considerably, by which I mean raised is the basement, bringing about 1 million plus people into the middle class in the country, with a population around 11 million these days. An incredible accomplishment, huge cash reserves, has really adroitly played Bolivia's economic hand to shield it from a lot of the economic blowback that other countries have been experiencing in recent years with the end of the extractive boom and so forth and so on. So, in clear contrast to the idea of Morales as some kind of two-dimensional caricature of a left-wing leader, what he has in fact been is a fairly effective economic manager using capital resources to invest in infrastructure, development, and necessary social reforms that the population has felt immediate benefits from, right? So all of that is kind of the starting point for how things could conceivably go wrong for a Morales candidacy. So with that kind of quick and dirty 100,000-foot take, I wanted to just spend a little more time in the sort of anthropologist mode thinking about what might have changed between, say, 2000, 2005 and now with respect to Morales' relationship to indigenous peoples in Bolivia that could conceivably explain some other outcome than a Morales victory. And so the way I would encourage us to think about this is less that might happen. I really don't think it would. I think Morales wins. I think Mas is continuing to run things through 2025. But there have been significant changes, and there have been tendencies that we can point to within the way that the Mas and Morales have approached questions of indigeneity that we can maybe point to and unpack just to give us something to talk about, something to think about. One thing that I think Kathy mentioned, and that is in a sense a kind of a truism now to harp on, is the lack of monolithic character of Bolivia's indigenous peoples. Indeed, that should be kind of the beginning point of our thinking about this. One way of thinking about it is that, when we think about Bolivia's highland and lowland indigenous peoples, they have very different voting patterns historically. I mean, I'm generalizing here, but when we talk about highland, primarily Quechua and Aymara speaking and Spanish speaking indigenous folks, many of whom might also live in fairly semi-urban contexts and are engaged in, or have historically been engaged in, what we might label some kind of peasant agricultural production. These folks have tended to vote kind of left indigenous when they've participated in elections in the last 20 years. Whereas when we talk about lowland Guarani-speaking folks, sometimes these will vote center-right, you know, and those are consistent differences in voting patterns that could lead one to think that if there was a concerted effort to cater to one or another of these voting blocks, that, you know, indigenous peoples could significantly split their vote in some way that would give competing party an opportunity. Here, that's not going to happen. Why? Because, as Kathy was clear, and it's indeed the case, there is no coherent, capable party apparatus other than the Mas who could engineer such a concerted effort. It's just too nuanced. It would be too difficult. But I do want to point to one other thing, and this is less about is Evo going to win, who's going to win, and more about what might we be looking at around possible conflicts through 2025. I think one thing that is likely to come home to roost in some way, and has to some extent here and there, and when we talk about Kipnis, that's the most visible example of it, are certain contradictions in the overall policies of the Mas administration. Perhaps the most glaring one is that around decolonization, enfranchisement of poor and indigenous populations in Bolivia, on the one hand, and on the other hand, economic development, government economic development priorities that are still geared in large ways to, you know, hydrocarbon sector, mining sector, you know, soy, you know, one day lithium, and so forth and so on. And that creates a situation where when it has happened, it hasn't happened very often, but it occasionally does happen, that those priorities are in direct collision. It's the economic development priorities that tend to win out. And if one were a skeptic and looking at the Morales administration and thinking about that, one might conclude, perhaps not entirely incorrectly, that when push comes to shove, you know, the priorities of Bolivia's majority indigenous peoples are increasingly less paramount. Instead, what we have is a broad economic development strategy that hasn't figured out how to move beyond extractives, and which is building infrastructure in anticipation of that to continue, which might then exacerbate future conflicts where, and mostly these happen when there's a very clear case of claims to concrete territory, right, land, on the one hand, of indigenous peoples, and a government priority to do something else, like build a highway or build a dam. It's a not unfamiliar tale, right? And we see that happening. You know, I mean, this was interesting. And the other thing I would like to say about that is something that we don't remember, or that often gets lost in quick takes on that very complicated episode, which I think illustrated a lot of different things to understand about Bolivian national politics, is that was not a case of the Morales administration running into conflict with indigenous peoples in this national park who did have well-established rights to their land and territory, which was then simply pushed aside and ignored conveniently while the government tried to push through its economic development plan. Yes, but it was also a case of different indigenous priorities coming into conflict, right? Because you really had strong support by a lot of in-migrating highland indigenous folks coming into that area who were very much in favor of the highway being built, but whose status in that space was different than the folks who had a very strong and very clearly, you know, and should have been, you know, fairly legally clear territorial defense of land, of territory and land. And that highland-lowland thing with the internal migration migration of highlanders to lowland areas is a major issue amongst Bolivia's indigenous peoples. They kind of not reconciled, and it really kind of blew up in that situation, right? So one could describe that as less Morales hypocritically, playing fast and loose with his, broad indigenous agenda, and more the fact that it can't always work that indigenous agendas neatly align. And so one of the things I think that we would want to pay more attention to is that over time it could be that that gets only ever more complicated, not straightforward. And I also think that the Morales administration, and the MAS in particular, in power, might be setting itself up for things like this to happen to it more often. Why? Well, because we think of the MAS as a social movement that came to power at a moment of social movement ferment and created a well-nigh unique historical situation of a real social movement in power, right? Much to the glee of social movement sociologists who now get to see the case of such a thing actually happening. What's going to happen now? It's actually happened, my God. But after all these years, the MAS is a political party. It's not a social movement anymore, right? It's a well-established, highly organized, with very strong projection into most corners of the Bolivian state in a way that no other party can even remotely compete with. Political party. And so the question of movement party is kind of a moot point at this point. When you're in power for this amount of time, you either figure out how to run things or things kind of fall apart around you. And by and large, they figured out how to run things. And part of what that's meant is there's things like clientelism, And so one of the things that I've been noting, and that is not, a shock or should be stunning to us all, is that a lot of the key sites of base organization representation of indigenous interests, for example, the CONAMAC or somebody like that, an organization that has been, very prominent in the ID movement in Bolivia, has, been subject to a kind of familiar divide and conquer strategy, right? Where there are now kind of different CONAMACs. There's been conflict over what the leadership of that organization should look like, who's legitimate, who's not. I saw recently that the MAS administration was giving new vehicles to the CONAMAC because they need that. This is a very familiar thing, and it's clientelism, right? And so what this could create, of course, right, is a competing cadre of disaffected indigenous leaders who are quite legitimate, but just not MAS, Pegas, and so on. And one could see that develop. It shouldn't have surprised us that when Morales lost the referendum for term limits and then decided to move on with them anyway after some wheeling and dealing with the court, that there were street protests in places like El Alto, right? As Kathy was mentioning, El Alto has a conflicted relationship with Evo Morales, even though El Alto is often also talked about as this, vibrant and dynamic indigenous city, and it absolutely is that. But there are reasons why a lot of Alteños are not always on board with Morales' approach, mostly because the MAS has, from the beginning, often been perceived as an interloper to the very strong organizational politics of El Alto, right? And so not altogether trusted there and so on. Evo has a better, I think his popularity is approximately double in the countryside than what he gets in the cities. And increasingly a lot of that city vote are urban indigenous peoples. And this is a longer conversation, one of the, let's call them, happy outcomes of the last 15, 20 years has been upward mobility of indigenous peoples. But that's also been accompanied by urban in-migration and by, really just the emergence of an indigenous middle class, an indigenous professional class, an indigenous intellectual community that has, blossomed and grown and consolidated. And a lot of these folks don't actually think MAS is so great, because they have other priorities and interests. So where that's going to go, I don't particularly know. The other thing is, you know, and Kathy was talking about how our media, sort of the way in which Bolivia is represented in English-speaking media, in English language media, and particularly in the United States, is just inadequate to the complexities of the country, and I can't agree with that more strongly. Very poor. But one way that's sort of like one of the flip sides of that is, you know, Morales has for many years now, right, been a kind of international superstar, celebrity, Aymara indigenous leader, going to the UN, talking about, you know, living well at the end and so forth and so on. And I think that and one of the things to say about that is that the way in which let's call it the symbolic politics of indigeneity that informs you know, public events and political public engagement of Morales and the MAS have for a long time been a very sort of two-dimensionalized pachamamismo type of thing, where what it means to be indigenous is a kind of hollowed out two-dimensional, you know, caricature of indigeneity that might play well at the UN, but is you know, completely disconnected in all manner of ways from the lived realities on the ground for variegated indigenous communities and people living sometimes in the country, sometimes increasingly in cities. And you know, that is a sort of one set of realities is moving in one direction, a national discourse around indigeneity is moving in another direction, and eventually these will just be so disconnected from one another that it might become alienating. I mean, on one hand, I think it's altogether unsurprising and indeed to be expected that in a national political arena, yeah, that's the currency. I mean, you can't drill down, you know, in a nuanced way to give the complex portraits of people's lives, so instead you get the normal kinds of symbolic cultural politics and so forth. And so I don't think we can say, oh, you really just shouldn't even, you know, no, because that's not realistic. But at a certain point it becomes just a kind of a threadbare rhetorical fact, and increasingly about which there might be increasing skepticism. So, you know, these are some of the things. One of the things that's happened is Bolivia's indigenous population has changed dramatically in the last 20 years. How those changes, what those changes might mean for the historical role that Morales has played in the enfranchisement of indigenous peoples remains to be seen. Is it possible that we shouldn't expect the same degree of support simply because this has been such a long process and there has been a sense? It's quite possible. So I would imagine that he'll get a lower vote total this time. He will win. It will be clear. There's really no way he can lose, I think. I mean, please never say things like that, but I would be amazed. As Kath was saying, it's just, there is no reasonable political alternative to Morales and the MAS. But going forward, I think we're going to have to see some kind of other development. And part of the thing that we're witnessing now with his fourth term is that, well, there's no one else besides Morales, and he really has created a situation where it's difficult to easily see who is that next dynamic group of national political leaders that can, you know, drive the next generation version of the MAS in a post-Morales universe. And who those are, I don't know, and where they might come from, I couldn't tell you. So I think that might also come to be a problem sooner than later. But anyway, I'll stop there and then look forward to talking about it.
Excellent. Thank you both, Kath and Rob. And we will go right to questions. I'm going to use my prerogative to open that because Rob ended on a question that was front of my mind, which is if term limits are now gone, then optional, then Evo could, you know, conceivably think I might plan to run again, and you know, he's relatively young
He's 50. Well,
for-
compared to U.S. presidents, again, he's super young.
Yeah, I would super young. So he could have a lot of life left in him as a viable leader as he sees it. So the question of succession, whether within the MAS as a party and as a movement, I think more broadly, thinking beyond, the challenges of that the government will face, how are they envisioning, or how are Bolivians envisioning what would be the next step, rather than the same person would have every right to run for it.
Can I say something real quick?
Sure.
I think it's interesting to note that that Mas has identified 3 key successors. That those will be the successors, or that will happen. I mean, one of the things that works best in Bolivia politics is the gray area and the lack of knowing. And often in previous presidential races, you never knew who was going to win. It was always very unpredictable. We all learned to never try to predict anything. But it's interesting to note that they have cited a new generation of 3 successors. Now, will those be the people? What does that mean? I don't know. But the 3 individuals are Manuel Canelas, who's the Minister of Communications. He's very dynamic, very smart, has graduate degrees, pragmatic. He's an openly gay minister. Adriana Salvatierra, half Chilean, and she renounced her Chilean citizenship because you can imagine that was an issue in Bolivian politics. A lawyer in her early 30s, head of the Bolivian Senate, very focal in the decriminalization of abortion debate and the passage of the Criminal Procedures Code that decriminalized abortion, although that was overturned. And Andrónico Rodriguez, who is a Chapari coca grower leader from the Federación Mamoré, who's 29, he's also a college graduate. So this is the vision that Mas has put forth as the future of the party. Will that be the future of the party? Will they come into power? Those things I don't know. I just wanted to point out the vision that has been presented and projected.
Rod, did you
Yeah,
want to
that's
add
great.
anything to that?
No. I would just say briefly, I think that if I were to, crystal ball gaze, and that's of course perilous, I think that what's most likely to happen is kind of a whimper rather than a bang. Rather than perhaps a next generation of a renovated Mas, dynamic, engaged with the country's urgent problems, continuing its historical work, decolonization, and so forth. It might likely be the case that there will just come to be more kinds of competitors essentially competing for that same turf, and that they will pick away at the Mas's, at this point, unquestioned, hegemony. And they just won't be able to continue to duplicate these electoral results, and it will be something else, something much more similar to, say, what we might have been what we lived in the late 80s, early 90s, yeah.
Thank you. Let's open for questions. We have a good full half hour. And since we're being filmed, I'm going to ask you to speak clearly what your question is, and we may have to repeat it as you begin to answer your question. Maybe you could summarize what the question was so that it's clear for those who are going to be watching the film. So we have Kevin in front, and then the gentleman in back. Kevin?
Yeah, I congratulate both of you on your very vigorous defense of the Mas government and your optimism for the election. I think that's great debate material, and there are different perspectives from the opposition and so forth. I would just like to ask to elaborate on a few issues that I think you kind of went over, you might have mentioned. But one is Evo Morales, the Mas government's enthusiasm for an extractive development model, which we're seeing the result of over 5 million hectares that are burning in Bolivia today, which puts him in bed with cattle ranchers, soybean growers. And we see also in Bolivia what's happened. Just to comment on this, Bolivia is importing more and more food. It's losing its capacity to produce food, particularly in rural communities in the highlands. What about that? Is that part of the Mas record? Is this something that's inevitable you can't stop? This urban migration, foreign immigration, and so forth, all of these kinds of questions come up. In this development model that we're looking at, that we need to create more employment, but still 80% is the informal sector in Bolivia, the economy. So I think I look at the Timbers case, yes, there are a lot of competing and complex interests there. But the long and short is, if Tibnis goes, it's going to impact on the water reserves in La Paz because of hydrological cycles, and that's going to hit in urban populations. You know, global climate change no longer an abstraction; it's going to hit them directly. We've seen water crisis in La Paz already. The government doesn't seem to care about that. They want to move cocoa growers into that area. There are Brazilian interests behind this that apparently have been moving and shaking a lot of the things. So I'm just saying, this embrace, this maybe this 21st century socialism embraces extractivism and denies indigenous rights in the lowlands and violates the constitutions they've created. It leaves me really troubled, and I don't see any slowing down of that. In fact, I see it's more vigorous. Another thing, trying to drill for more oil and protect the areas. This is the first government ever in Bolivia that stripped away protection of protected areas that they're not up for as an economic resource. So there are a lot of issues here I think glossed over need to be deepened. And I don't know it's going to make much difference in the election. It's going to, obviously some sectors are very motivated by this. We read Ricardo Calle's pieces in Página 7 and other pundits. Gonzalo Colque, who's the director of Fundación Tierra, the primary think tank on land issues and rural development in Bolivia, says that where the fires are occurring are all where the government's put its emphasis on its extractive clearing of the frontier, moving more and more into these extractive industries, cattle, soybeans, and so on. So I just want to raise this, and I think maybe for more vigorous debate about these issues.
And just a quick comment?
Yep.
Didn't I talk about that?
I thought you soft-pedaled it.
No, I didn't intend to soft-pedal it. I mean, I thought I was clear that there's a contradiction, and the contradiction is between the economic development model and its investment in and continued reliance upon extractive economic growth, and a lot of the other broader social and other agendas around which, you know, the legitimacy of Morales and Mas are fundamentally reliant. So the point about Tibnis in my mentioning of it was not that, oh yeah, that's the one thing we always point to when we want to talk about a place where indigenous folks seem to be kind of in conflict with the Morales government, but more that it exposed, in addition, a basic contradiction between when the economic development model comes up against other priorities, the economic development model wins. And that suggests, down the line, many more kinds of similar possible conflicts of this sort. You know, the role that, again, Brazil plays in this is like a thing we can talk about as well, and so forth. But yeah, no, that's, I would think, the most important point to be made. If what you want to do is draw attention to ways in which that government needs to think more about its economic policies in the long run.
Is this leftist politics to see this extractive? That's
Well,
my question.
it's fascinating.
Socialism.
Right. Well, what I would say about that, I thought, is Bolivia's economy looks one way from the inside out and another way from the outside in. And so, I don't know whether we should call it leftist or whether these typical cardinal directions for the way we're talking about politics really make sense here. What it is Bolivia Inc. globally for social or redistributive policies domestically.
So I haven't forgotten, gentleman in the back, I want to give Kathy a chance to respond also to Kevin, who I think is saying, regardless of the electoral success of this at this current moment, might there be crises that are, you know, just around the corner, or that are being created that are eventually going to be very, very negatively consequential for Bolivia, not just for the Morales, not just for this regime.
Crisis right now, like a massive forest fire.
So that's happened in the past. It's just not quite at the scale.
Yeah, I think that, you know, the
Say it's
important thing
okay,
that
right?
there, no, it's not okay, and these fires happen every year, and this year it's been much worse.
Yeah.
It's hit the entire region. There are problems with slash and burn agriculture. Morales hasn't solved those problems. I think that that's very, very clear. You know, above my island at the border with Parque Tunari, it's on fire every year. There are hectares and hectares lost. It's a huge problem. It's a problem that Morales policy has not stopped. It is a problem that pre-existed Morales policy. It is a problem that will continue, and it's a very genuine and concrete problem. Extractivism is another very key problem and focus, and it looks to the multiple pressures and goals that have the Morales administration that are often conflicting. Generating income, providing basic services, these are things that are priorities that have led them to be dependent on extractivism. The shifts in the hydrocarbons law, the nationalization of the hydrocarbons industry has given them a great amount of funds to invest things. Dependence on that continues. There isn't a good long-term strategy to diversify the income. Those are all very, very real things. I think that it's hard to do from a transition where there was hydrocarbons exploration that was limited and none of the benefits reached Bolivia to the boom of the benefits and having those funds to invest, and how to shift away from that is something that the Morales administration hasn't learned or hasn't implemented. Now that it would be implemented in the future, or that other governments in the region are doing a better job, my guess is that they are not. I don't think you can look at the Brazilians or the Argentines or the Ecuadorians or the Colombians and look at a sounder alternative policy. I think that what you identify are all genuine problems. I think the urban migration problem is also a problem of reduction of poverty possibilities. People in rural areas now, their children are going to the university. It's a dynamic that it can point to extreme poverty, and it can also point to extreme prosperity. How you keep people in rural areas is a very, very difficult dynamic to maintain. I would say that the migration to other countries has actually reduced a great deal. Why? A great deal of migration to Argentina. The Argentine economy is a disaster. The quality of life, you see many migrants to Argentina coming back to Bolivia because the economic situation is better. The economic situation in Spain, another source for Bolivian migrants, is also quite difficult. You see people returning. You see people who frequently would go to the United States that now, because of the complex situation with immigration in the United States, that are going less. I don't see that migration out of the country to be a trend that's increasing. I would see that would be more decreasing. And also I would disagree with you about the government stimulating coca planting within the Tigris region. I think that we all agree, and I think we both mentioned the contradiction of the prior consultation, the Tigris issue, the conflicting interests. I think it's important to also note that a great deal of the pressure for the Tigris Road was from Beni and the Benianos, who wanted access to markets and to the rest of the country because they are reliant on Santa Cruz for their cattle industry. But that was another pull of pressure. And I would say if the Morales administration had a really dark strategic objective, my guess would be that it's not so much hydrocarbons and it's more a route to Brazil and a way around Santa Cruz after the Media Luna uprisings. I'm not saying that's a great, wonderful thing or a justification, but I think that's one of the motivations. There's been a great deal of coca control in the Tigris. There's been a delimitation. There's continuing forced eradication in that region, and coca grower houses burned down, and people that were Morales' own constituents in the past where that's limited. You can look at the coca monitoring and the levels of eradication there, and that is actually something that they're controlling. Why? Because the price of coca in the Chapari and the access and the privilege of the Cato is something that tends them to limit that. So there is forced eradication in those regions. I don't think the government is stimulating coca production there. And when I have been there, that has been the case. There's been forced eradication.
So, I won't forget you. Let's go to the gentleman in the back. And if other show of hands, we take them now as well.
Sure. The question is about the politicization of the armed forces. It was only like 2 months ago, General William Coleman said, the commander of the armed forces, said that the armed forces of Bolivia will morirán anticolonialistas. They will die being anticolonialists. He also said that there are segments of the Bolivian population, namely the opposition, that are greedy, that they want to destroy everything that the Morales regime has achieved so far in taking an appeal in power. So even if, my question would be, even if the opposition takes control of the Congress, or even if by some miracle or so, Mesa can take control of the presidency, wins the presidency, can they actually govern with these, in my view, politicized armed forces? Thank you.
I think it's important to note that the Bolivian armed forces have always been politicized. If you want to look at the Bolivian armed forces historically, except the Garcia Mesa dictatorship, which was a really unfortunate narco bleep in Bolivian history, you see a Bolivian armed forces largely dependent on U.S. economic assistance, largely dependent on U.S. Training. You have more Bolivians attending the School of the Americas than any other country except Colombia, and Colombia is a much larger country. You're looking at U.S. training, U.S. policy determination, U.S. naming commanders. You see, for example, in gross human rights violations in Bolivia, the commanders or the people who commit the violations almost consistently have been part of, have been graduates of the School of the Americas. So that this idea that the armed forces previously were neutral, or that I remember hearing an event in Wola, the Southern Command said to me, "Don't worry, we've told the military, the Bolivian military command they shouldn't have a coup, so it's going to be okay." You know, it's not a neutral institution. I think, you know, Williams Kaliman is not my favorite or the most dynamic individual. It's interesting that the trust issues with the Morales eradication, he came to power after being head of the Joint Task Force, the eradication force. So, you know, this compliance with forced eradication or the rationalization method is what led him to power. I think the anti-colonialist discourse is to cast off a past that was really colonialized, and I think that that's a discourse that perhaps people don't appeal to people, but I think it's part of the protocol and the verbiage and the discourse of an armed forces to demonstrate that they are subject to civilian command as they should be. My assessment is, if the government changes, that they, you know, I would say that the armed forces generally follow the hand that feeds them. And so their budget, you know, and their loyalty will go to an executive that dispenses with their budget. The problem is, you know, previously, in previous decades, the person that paid their budget was the United States, and that led to a violation of Bolivian national sovereignty.
Well, that's exactly what I was going to add. I was just going to say that I think what we need to understand is that when we hear this kind of discourse coming from the Bolivian armed forces, I think we need to put it in a context of the broad defense of Bolivian sovereignty. And that one of the things that at the moment of transition to the Morales years, the Mas era, that was accompanied by kind of strong political assertions of sovereignty. Sovereignty over non-renewable resources, reestablishing, you know, the autonomy of Bolivia vis-a-vis the United States, and so on. And so I would actually understand that kind of comment as really just an articulation of, you know, a military commander repeating what would be an uncontroversial thing for military commanders to say, which is that, you know, we're a sovereign country and so forth and so on, and our purpose is to defend the territorial integrity of the nation. And so the language of sovereignty is a Mas-inflected discourse at this time. But I think the issue of sovereignty really became a critical one. And I mean, I just add one more little thing. It really is a kind of an elevation of a discourse that emanated from questions of sovereignty as they were understood in the context of Indigenous enfranchisement, autonomy and self-determination. And so that then became a frame of reference that became the mode of articulating how people talked about Bolivian sovereignty, right? And so it shouldn't be surprising. Notions of sovereignty just migrated from that strong discussion of the need for autonomy that was a kind of guiding orientation to Indigenous enfranchisement to how the Mas talks about those kinds of questions. But I mean, I think that's what it is, sovereignty.
Yeah, I think it's the new framing of patriotism,
Yeah.
and I think the armed forces, that's the way it's being expressed.
Yeah.
I'm going to take two questions here. This
We
woman
haven't-
right behind.
As a result of the movement in the last 15 years, you haven't described the role or status of those who traditionally led the economy, the whiter Bolivians. Has there been white flight? Has there been brain drain? What is the role of that sector of the Bolivian society today?
Well, just real quick.
Let's take the one
Okay,
behind
yeah,
you
good.
so we don't run out of time.
Oh, yes. My question is regarding the sustainability of the current economic system that Mesa has implemented in regards to what you mentioned as well, the social conflicts that could happen. I think Bolivia is running, obviously, an external deficit. They're running, I believe, a fiscal deficit as well. You've been burning through international reserves over the past 5 years. Now we're under $8 billion, I think. In a context where Brazil and Argentina are becoming or are reducing their demand for Bolivian natural gas, and in a context as well as Bolivia pegs their currency to the dollar, and will, I believe, more likely than not have to devalue, non-economists will have to devalue in maybe the next couple of years. Obviously, the administration is going to be more constrained to undertaking a lot of these efforts, social programs, etc., especially when a lot of Bolivian goods are still imported. What could that eventual devaluation of the currency, more constrained fiscal situation, what would be the impact to that on these social programs, as well as in the context of a country that has a history of social mobilization? Would people go to the streets against more, say, constrained programs or whatnot? Apologies if that's a bit long of a question.
So just real quick, if I could.
Why don't we take those two questions?
Yeah. So with the first question, I guess there's two things. So one part of which harkens back to some extent to what Kevin was talking about earlier. There's two kinds of economic elites in Bolivia, largely in La Paz and largely in Santa Cruz, and they dominate different economic sectors, right? And as should be no secret, the center of economic power of the country, particularly during the Banzer regime up through Sanchez de Lozada era, was Santa Cruz, right? The dynamic economic development space and so forth, at least discursively. Once Morales came to power, that became a fraught scenario, culminating in what was essentially a regional secession movement that came to a head in 2008, the Media Luna, etc. What the MAS has successfully been able to do is more or less remove the sort of economic, technocratic types who were in high levels of government decision-making from Santa Cruz, who would just take for granted a kind of Santa Cruz-based perspective on how the economy should work. And they've been largely successful. Interestingly, and as I think Kath was clear in laying out, there has not since then really been a coherent reformulation of that power in any political sense. Instead, people have kind of just gone about their business, right? And what one might suggest is that the Mas administration has let that happen. And that even, one might even go further and say that in recent years, there's been some further rapprochement and an effort by the Mas government to reach out, right, to dynamic economic wheeler-dealers in the Santa Cruz region, and to work with them, right? And so, just to cap that thinking off, going back to Kevin's question, if the key to the Mas's continual political reproduction, social reproduction, is its legitimacy, if it gets in too thick with Santa Cruz economic elites, that creates backlash, quite possibly, for a constituency that sees them, the Mas, as largely the bulwark against the way things have always been until recently. Did you want to?
Yeah, I mean, I think in terms of, the upper classes and the Bolivian elite fleeing, I think initially there was a great deal of that. I think that there was the vision and there was moving back to Miami, and there was a lot of gossip about all our land was going to be confiscated and our property.
Suburban Maryland?
Maybe Chevy Chase, there are some Bolivian elites there. I think that if you were a state elite and that you had a rotating post with these government coalitions that were formed, then you definitely lost your place in the rotation unless you became an opposition Congress member. But also the salaries were dramatically reduced for all the government posts, and it made it less attractive. So I think past political elites athletes tend to move to Miami or to the Washington suburbs, and that definitely happened. I think there was a whole group of NGOs that were tied to these state institutions that had a great deal of funding and often a great deal of U.S. funding, not necessarily because of evil motives, but because of the Article 98 limitations on state funding that went to these NGOs that had a kind of solid income that also have chosen to left because, it's not the salaries in Bolivia and the amount of money that people make for these posts are now significantly lower, and the amount of external NGO funding is significantly lower. So there's a flight in terms of that issue, but in terms of business people, in part, and Kevin pointed out the contradiction of support of large-scale agriculture. There is a whole bit of upper economic elite that hasn't suffered in this growing pie, which comes to the next question of what happens if the pie shrinks. And that's an important question. But in terms of a business elite, they haven't. It's not that there's this projection sometimes that the Morales administration has taken away things from a certain group to give them to other groups. And I think that may be the case in terms of government posts. We don't have a party coalition, post-electoral coalition. We have a pre-electoral coalition of diverse groups, of social movements, of indigenous groups. This fluctuates, and there's a lot of internal conflict. So, but you don't see economic elites abandoning the country because they're making money. The question in the next couple of years, it will be more constrained. I think that's correct. I think that it's interesting that Morales' economic policies are congratulated by the International Monetary Fund consistently, which is something that Bolivia never achieved when it was following the dictates of the International Monetary Fund during the structural adjustment periods. And so to a certain extent, the Bolivian economy is contracting. But the other question is compared to what? And compared to other economies that with a reduction in gas prices and hydrocarbons and the falling out of those markets, Bolivia is doing considerably better. The suggestion that Argentina and Brazil will, cut back significantly on gas purchases hasn't happened. It's really interesting that you have a Bolsonaro government that stands ideologically almost diametrically opposed to the Morales administration, but they're still signing bilateral agreements. They just signed a bilateral drug control cooperation agreement, and business is business. And what you see is a renewal of those gas contracts, a renewal of dependency. Now negotiations, depending on what happens with the government in Peru, but a very good suggestion that they'll be exporting gas to southern Peru, that they're going to be exporting gas to Paraguay with a strong bilateral relationship with the Paraguayans. So there's a strategy. It's a strategy based on extractivism, and it's not clear what's going to happen. But there's no short-term falling out of the Bolivian economy compared to the kinds of things, for example, that you see at the crisis in Argentina.
Yeah, and just to add to that, we shouldn't forget that Bolivia's economy is much smaller and much less diversified in these ways. And so, in this sense, it's actually kind of good because it allows, economic managers in the country to kind of see what's up. And so, while it's the case that Bolivia has benefited from this, kind of neo-extractive model, and as we've been talking about the implications of that politically and socially for the country going forward, as Kat was saying, there's absolutely no expectation that Bolivia's prodigious gas reserves won't continue to be a source of ongoing economic revenue. And I think one clue to the Morales administration's long-term strategy for this, right, is the lithium thing. I'm not offering that because I want us to discuss whether that's a viable industry or anything like that. But what it suggests is a strategic approach where Bolivia is looking to find critical niches in the global economy in which it can be a dominant competitor for the foreseeable future. in a way that, given the size and scale of that economy, and given partners in the region, would keep it from the kinds of disastrous economic dissolution that we talk about with pre-structural adjustment era or whatever. And the bet is that government is making is that they can do that, right? I'm calling it that.
Thank you. We had three more. I said Coletta, gentleman in the back here, and Kevin wanted to add something as well. Oh,
And Jeff.
and Jeff. All right, that's four. So why don't we do all four and then come back to our speakers to round it up? All right, Coletta.
Well, I was just struck that we're almost to the end of this conversation and we haven't really discussed U.S. Bolivian relations at all, and I was just wondering, for a change.
That is the
Washington.
change, yes.
That is, I was just saying, yes, and you say that like it's a bad thing.
It's not a bad thing, but I was just wondering, it's really a question for you, Kathy, since you're on the ground, or Alejandro, if you just want to comment on how you see U.S. Bolivian relations at the present time and the U.S. role vis-a-vis the elections when the U.S. has played a more benevolent role in the past, but I haven't really heard it today. So just curious your take on that.
Let's then go from back to front. So Jeff, and then you.
So this is more a comment, it sort of follows to some of what Kevin said. Striking to me that, extractivism means a couple of things, right? There's an agricultural piece, which is, I think, similar to what, the PT clearly allied itself with big ag exporters in Brazil, and sort of the collapse of external markets faced them a huge challenge that could happen, right? And it produces all kinds of contradictions between the ideological beliefs of the PT or the boss and sort of who they ally with and their challenges and contradictions down the road. And then, gas is sort of similar, like oil, difficult to escape the temptation to keep expanding and not diversifying, and nobody, but apparently Norway, has succeeded in sort of breaking that cycle. So it's not a question that strikes me as a challenge for development strategies everywhere.
I was going to ask about the relations with the U.S., but also what about the environmental failures that we're all covering in the world and not identifying the water shortage? And it's going to be a big issue in Bolivia.
I think Kevin was putting this.
My comment was just that this question back here about the elites, the white elites, and how Santa Cruz has represented that sector for a long time. They escaped land reform during the revolution. The U.S. supported Santa Cruz escaping land reform and so forth. So you had this big concentration of large landowners in Santa Cruz, middle-sized landowners, which has persisted despite all this change in the highlands in Bolivia. And so the question is, when Evo Morales campaigned in the early part of his administration, that sector really felt threatened by the discourses and the programs that the government was saying. There was talk about land reform, territorial rights. He was trying to build his leftist coalitions with a lot of different actors and sort of pushing that and so forth. And then we find, 5 years into his government, he starts violating his own plurinational constitution, which has all these articles for the environment and stuff, by supporting these interests. And basically what happened was they mobilized against him and had a powerful autonomy movement. And my interpretation of some, and this is not necessarily to prove it, mouse back down from that threat because they didn't want to break up the nation, they didn't want to have this kind of conflict in the streets or whatever, violence or whatever, you could argue. But they backed down, they said, this part of ours, leftist, quote unquote, we're going to abandon this whole land rights thing and make these people happy and start giving them subsidies, right?
Right.
And so that's what was one of the interpretations why that new alliance with the right and the left came about, with Evo Morales and the Santa Cruz elites, which we're seeing today in this forest fires.
So we'll go back to our speakers. So Ron, you want to go first? And
I'm just going to address one part of that, and then I think Kathy can talk about some of the other things like U.S.-Bolivia relations. Although I work in a Latin American studies center here in D.C., and we frequently are asked about U.S.-Bolivia relations. The climate change piece, and I'll just talk about that. So Bolivia has an interesting role there, and has been, kind of punching above its weight around climate change policy of a multilateral international sort since at least 2010, where it held like a non-aligned major climate change meeting after the failed Copenhagen meeting in 2009, and has really been a kind of proactive, very visible presence in multilateral spaces regionally and internationally and elsewhere around climate change issues, which incorporate the water question, about which Bolivian representatives have said a lot of things. Now, strangely, the person who was, for a considerable amount of that time, the main representative, Bolivian representative, Pablo Solon, is really kind of at odds with the administration these days. And so the story is a more complicated one than I'm telling right now. But suffice it to say that Bolivia has really been a kind of lightning rod for these kinds of international climate convenings outside of the normal multilateral traditional spaces of the international system.
All right, Kat?
Okay, well, Bolivian-U.S. relations, they've been better, they've been way worse. I think that, people always want there to be ambassadors appointed. I think there's this idea that there's no communication at all between the two countries, and that's not true. I think that, there's, one of the things to look at about the Media Luna rebellion, maybe, Mas has reconciled friction with the large landholding elites in Santa Cruz, but there were platos rotos from the thing. They expelled the U.S. ambassador. There was a clear U.S. role in that uprising. There was a clear vote in the constitutional referendum for the higher landholding limit. That was something that was backed by the Bolivian population. And so I think in terms of the...
I'm not sure about that. When they did the constitutional change, they reduced it down to the number of hectares that they had.
Well, there was a vote. There was a limit. There was a referendum on the Constitution of recognition of issues that couldn't be decided in the debate. And one of them was setting the ceiling on what was going to be latifundio, or what was the high amount. And the choices were 5,000 hectares or 10,000 hectares. And in the referendum, the Bolivian population voted for 10,000 hectares. Is that a good thing? Is it a bad thing? I don't know. That was voted for. Does that mean that naturally implies a land use strategy or promoting as voters large-scale agriculture? It doesn't. But they voted for that limit. So I think it's a mixed bag on the Media Luna and the concessions and the things that go.
One thing about that. What they changed in that, when they made that limit, was that they would only apply to new lands acquired. It wouldn't apply to old lands acquired. So basically that really took all these people off the hook from being threatened for any kind of...
Well, I agree with you that there hasn't been significant land reform.
No, but I'm saying that was the thing that got them to approve it. It was,
But it was a voter approval. It wasn't, it was a popular vote in a referendum. It wasn't a congressional negotiation.
It's manipulated by some people in Congress who are alive with the targets. I know the guy who did it. Luis.
Okay. And the Bolivian-U.S. I think, and I've always argued for a very long time, which was not very a popular argument here, that Bolivian-U.S. relations are much better when there's no money in the middle of it. And now we have a significant, there's no significant funding to the U.S. There's no significant way for the U.S. to pressure in Bolivian politics and throw their weight around. And in my perception, that goes much better. In terms of people who are coming and working in the U.S. Embassy, I try to engage with them, and there are people that I've liked pretty well and people I have aggressively disliked. I won't name names, but my point is I always found that the discourse here was the Morales administration is ideological, you can't reason with them, he's always furious, there's nothing to it. And I don't think that's the case. I think diplomacy works, and that good diplomacy, and you want to keep a skilled diplomat in those posts. You don't want Kanye West as the appointed U.S. charge aide to Bolivia or any other country. That diplomacy works, and strategy and keeping a low profile works well. I think that the person at the embassy in La Paz now, the charge aide, is a person who is strategic, who is a person that engages with the Morales administration without a public profile. I don't think that there's U.S. influence to be thrown around, but there isn't a negative, corrosive discourse from La Paz. I think that in Washington, mercifully, one high-level congressional assistant said to me, I've always thought, Kathryn, that it's much better for Bolivia when the U.S. doesn't pay any attention to it at all. And it's very good to know that for the most part, Bolivia's not on the Trump administration radar. I think we'd like to keep it that way. We don't want another suggestion of bringing aircraft carriers to the coast of Bolivia, as has been suggested in the past, you know.
Airlifted it.
Okay, well, airlifted in, but who was the U.S.?
I'm
It
sure.
was the U.S. Senator who was going to take the, yeah, so I don't know, you know, what wretched thing, but so far it's not on Trump's radar. And so I would say that things are going pretty well between the U.S. and Bolivia. I don't think naming ambassadors solve things. I think that there's a productive discourse. The previous head of the U.S. Embassy in La Paz made a big stink that U.S. coca cultivation numbers were far superior to the United Nations of Drug and Crime. And there was a huge kerfuffle that ended up in the U.S. and Bolivia and the U.S. and Peru comparing notes. And what you've seen in this procedure at a technical level is that the U.S. numbers, which have been very creative historically, and I would say politically motivated, have moved much closer to the Bolivian numbers. And because I think that you have a Bolivian crop monitoring system that's geo-referenced and verified with presence, that's very important. So I would say really not so bad. I don't think that there's an ideological bonding, but I don't think there's an overt conflict, and I don't think that the relationship is high profile, and I think that's probably going okay in my estimation.
I think that will be the closing note. And just to remark per Coletta's question, and how Kath just finished, I mean, it was striking that the U.S. policy didn't come up till the very end of this, and I think that speaks to everything Kathy just said, but also the hunger for really discussing what's going on in Bolivia, with all its complications, with all of its contradictions, and wondering even if this near election is not going to be particularly close, which is what we've heard from our speakers. What's upcoming? What are the challenges for Mas and Evo in Bolivia going forward? And I think that's what we've usefully focused on. So I really want to thank both of our speakers, Kath and Rob, for your brilliant job, and of course we'll all be staying tuned on October 20th. So thanks everyone for coming. Thanks for your questions and your comments.